He walked in soaking wet, coat dripping, eyes distant like he'd seen ghosts. No one paid him much attention, just another old man with a limp and a black coffee habit. But when he finished, he didn't leave a tip. He didn't say a word, just left a wrinkled flag on the table and walked out into the rain. An hour later, the door opened again. 7 Marines stepped in, eyes sharp, jaws tight. They saw the flag, and without a sound, every single one of them saluted. No one in the diner spoke a word after that, because sometimes silence says more than any story ever could. You'll never forget what happened next. Walter Dean wasn't the kind of man you'd notice in a crowd anymore. At 84, his steps were measured, his back slightly stooped, and his expression quietly distant, as if some part of him still lived in another time or waited for someone who never returned. He blended into the background of diners and sidewalks, just another old man with a limp and a worn coat. But behind those tired eyes was a lifetime that most people couldn't begin to imagine. Walter served as a United States Marine. He enlisted at 17, forged in the chaos of Vietnam, where he earned a reputation among his unit for being quiet, resourceful, and unshakably loyal. He didn't talk much about what happened over there, not because he was hiding it, but because he believed the battlefield was no place to relive. He carried the memories in silence, etched into the lines of his face and the way he folded his hands before speaking. After Vietnam, Walter stayed in the Corps. He wasn't made for civilian life, he used to say. He found purpose in service, and his steady hands and sharp instincts made him a natural instructor. He was transferred to Camp Pendleton, where he spent the next 2 decades training young Marines, molding raw recruits into disciplined warriors. He was the kind of mentor who demanded the best but never raised his voice. His authority came from something deeper, the kind of respect only earned in the field. He met his wife Eleanor during those Pendleton years. She was a nurse at the base hospital, strong-willed and full of laughter. They married within 6 months. Life was simple, grounded, the way Walter liked it. Together they raised one son, Mason, who, unsurprisingly, followed his father's path and became a Marine. Walter never pushed him. Mason chose it on his own. And Walter had never been prouder than the day he pinned the eagle, globe, and anchor on his son's chest. But war has a cruel way of circling back. Mason was killed in Afghanistan during his 3rd deployment. It was an ambush. The details came in fragments, each one cutting deeper than the last. Walter received the folded flag from the military officer at his front door without saying a word. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just stood there holding it, like he was cradling the last living part of his family. Eleanor died 8 years ago, cancer, just when Walter had started to find footing again. Since then, he's lived alone in a modest 1-bedroom apartment outside San Diego. The walls are bare except for one shelf, a photo of Mason in uniform, a worn harmonica, a metal case sealed shut, and that same folded flag. His days are quiet now. Most mornings he walks to the corner diner, where the waitress knows his order before he says it. Black coffee, no sugar, eggs over hard. He brings a newspaper he never finishes, and he sits by the window watching people who never look back. Some days he forgets what day it is. Other days he forgets why he came. The VA doctor called it early-stage memory decline. Walter called it life catching up. He has no close family left. Most of his brothers in arms are gone, buried, forgotten, or unreachable. The world moved on and Walter let it. But something inside him still burns quietly. Not bitterness, not regret, but a sense of unfinished duty. He doesn't say much, but when he does, people tend to listen. Because Walter Dean is the kind of man time couldn't erase, only hide for a while. Walter Dean's fingers hovered just above the folded flag. He didn't touch it right away. He never did. His eyes studied every worn crease in the fabric, the softened corners, the faded white stars, the smudges only he could explain. To anyone else, it looked like a wrinkled triangle of cloth. But to Walter, it was a story told in silence. As he stared at the flag on the diner table, the chatter around him faded. The clink of forks, the hum of conversation, the soft static of the radio, all dissolved into the background. His mind drifted, not backward in time, but deeper, into places few people ever return from. Jungle, fire, screams. He was 23 again. Vietnam. The jungle smelled of rot and smoke. His boots sank into the mud with each step. The radio on his back crackled with desperate calls. But half the time, the signal was jammed or lost in the thunder of mortars. He remembered that night, the ambush, the screaming, the blood in the rain. He remembered crawling across an open field under fire just to pull Corporal Rios back behind cover. Too late. Rios was already gone, his eyes staring upward, as if trying to find something in the treetops. Walter had to drag his lifeless body through brush and bullets. They got out of there. Barely. And 2 days later, Walter stood in a camp in silence while the lieutenant handed him a folded flag. It was his first time. He didn't know what to do with it, just stared until someone whispered, "You fold it the way you'd want it handed to your family." His hands were trembling, but the fold had to be perfect. That's what he told himself. Years passed. Wars changed, but the ritual never did. Walter folded many flags over the years. For young Marines he trained who didn't come back. For old friends who never woke up. Every fold was like a stitch in a wound that wouldn't close. But the one that cut the deepest came decades later, in silence, with a knock on the door. He remembered that morning like it was yesterday. The Marine chaplain didn't speak at first, just held out the triangle of cloth, pressed tight and neat, like a final salute. Walter didn't ask which base, which road, which enemy. He just looked at the man and said, "Mason." The chaplain nodded. His son, Sergeant Mason Dean, had died in an IED blast on his third tour in Afghanistan. He was 31. The same age Walter had been when he left the battlefield for good. He held that flag longer than anything else in his life. Longer than his rifle, longer than his marriage certificate, longer than even the dog tags he once wore under his shirt. It never left the small cedar box by the window. Eleanor had placed a photo of Mason next to it, dressed in blue, smiling like the boy Walter raised, not the soldier who never came back. For years, Walter would pass that box without opening it. Just knowing it was there was enough. But this morning felt different. It had rained the night before. Not just a drizzle, a hard, relentless storm that pounded the roof until 3 a.m. Walter hadn't slept. Instead, he sat at the edge of his bed, thinking of all the birthdays he never got to say out loud. Today would have been Mason's 39th. He stood up just after sunrise, opened the box for the first time in 5 years, and stared at the flag. Not at its shape, but at its story. Not at what it represented, but who. For reasons he couldn't explain, not even to himself, he folded it into his coat pocket and walked to the diner like always. It wasn't planned. He hadn't rehearsed anything. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't go back into that box. As the waitress poured his coffee, he kept glancing at the flag beside him. Not for comfort, not for grief, but for permission. It was time to let it go. Not forget, but let go. The kind of letting go that only warriors understand. When the mission is done, when the battle is over, and when silence, not ceremony, says everything that needs to be said. The bell above the door jingled softly as Walter stepped inside, brushing the last raindrops from his shoulders. The morning crowd had already settled in, regulars tucked into their booths, eyes half glued to newspapers or the muted TV above the counter. The smell of bacon and brewed coffee hung in the air like routine. Familiar, comforting. But for Walter, today felt anything but. He made his way to his usual seat by the window, third booth from the left, where the light hit just right, and the world outside looked a little slower. He slid into the seat with the careful stiffness of someone who had long made peace with joint pain. His overcoat dripped quietly onto the linoleum floor. A new waitress approached, barely in her 20s, cheerful, too quick with the pad in her hand. She offered a polite smile. "Morning, sir. Black coffee?" Walter nodded. "And eggs, over hard." "Sure thing." She scribbled and turned, but her eyes hesitated when she spotted the folded flag he gently placed on the table beside his mug. It was worn, clearly old, its once crisp folds now softened with time, corners slightly curled. It rested like a quiet monument between the napkin holder and the salt shaker. A few minutes later, she returned with the plate, but curiosity got the better of her. With a casual chuckle, she asked, Why not straighten that out a bit? Kinda looks like, I don't know, an old rag. Her tone wasn't cruel, just thoughtless. The kind of offhand comment someone makes when they haven't lived long enough to know better. She didn't mean to insult, but the words landed hard. Walter didn't look up. He didn't even flinch. He simply placed both hands around the coffee cup, letting the warmth seep into his skin, and stared out the window. From the next booth over, a man in his 40s, button-down shirt, Bluetooth in ear, typing something into a laptop, snorted under his breath. Probably thinks he's some war hero or something, he mumbled, not quite quietly enough. Old guys and their flags, always trying to prove something. The waitress laughed nervously and retreated to the counter, unsure of whether she'd said something wrong. She glanced back, but Walter still hadn't moved. Behind the kitchen window, the cook paused mid-motion. Frank had worked there for decades. He was in his 60s, hands calloused, eyes tired but sharp. He didn't talk much either, but he watched everything. And today he watched Walter. Frank didn't know the man well. They had exchanged nods over the years, a kind of silent agreement between two men who didn't need to explain themselves. But when Frank saw that flag, the way it was folded, the way it was placed, something inside him stirred. That wasn't just a decoration. That was a statement, a farewell, or perhaps a surrender. Walter slowly reached into his coat, pulled out a crumpled dollar bill, and placed it under the mug. Then he looked at the flag, long and hard like it was the last time. He stood. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was calm, steady. It didn't seek to correct or lecture. It simply existed, like a bell tolling at the end of a service. That flag's not wrinkled, he said, more to the room than to any person. It fought, just like I did. No one responded. The waitress froze behind the counter. The man with the laptop suddenly found something very interesting on his screen. Even the sizzling from the kitchen seemed to hush. Walter turned and walked to the door, rain still tapping the glass. He didn't take the flag. He left it there, alone on the table, surrounded by half-empty creamers and the echo of something greater than anyone in that room fully understood. As the door closed behind him, Frank slowly wiped his hands on a towel and stared through the open kitchen window at the flag. He didn't need to know the details. He didn't need the man's name or medals. He just knew. Something important had just been left behind. The diner had returned to its rhythm. The morning rush had come and gone, replaced by the slow lull between breakfast and lunch. Plates clinked softly, someone flipped a page of the newspaper, and the TV in the corner now played a weather update no one listened to. Outside, the rain had eased into a fine drizzle, leaving the windows streaked and dim. But the flag still sat there, unmoved, unclaimed. Folded with the weight of memory and loss, it rested quietly on the Formica tabletop, a lone triangle of faded red, white, and blue that didn't belong to anyone, or perhaps belonged to too many. Frank, the cook, had looked at it at least a dozen times since Walter left. Each time he turned back to his grill, the sight of it stayed with him. Not as a mystery, but as a message he couldn't quite explain. The waitress, too, seemed unusually quiet. She moved from table to table with the distracted air of someone still processing her own mistake. Every glance at the flag reminded her she had said something careless, something she couldn't unsay. Then it happened. A low rumble rolled across the parking lot, tires cracking over wet asphalt. A black SUV pulled to a smooth, deliberate stop right in front of the diner's door. It wasn't the kind of vehicle that screamed attention, but somehow it shifted the air in the room. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The bell above the door jingled once, and then they entered. 7 men. Not in uniform, but they didn't need it. You could see it in the way they walked. The straight backs, the squared shoulders, the eyes that scanned everything in silence. Civilian clothes, yes, jeans, flannel, leather jackets, hooded coats, but nothing about them looked casual. Every one of them carried something invisible on their shoulders, a weight only those who had served would recognize. They didn't speak. They didn't ask where to go. They already knew. The lead man, a tall figure in his late 60s, with a closely cropped gray beard and a slight limp, locked eyes with the flag. He walked to it, slow and purposeful. The others followed behind, fanning out slightly as they approached the table, their boots echoing faintly on the floor tiles. Not one person in the diner moved. The waitress froze mid-pour. A toddler in a booster seat stopped babbling. Even the TV seemed quieter now, like the room itself was holding its breath. The tall man reached the table and looked down at the flag. He didn't touch it at first, just stood there. A moment of silence, not forced, but instinctive. Then with deliberate care he lifted the flag. There was no hesitation, no trembling. He refolded it, each corner tucked perfectly, each edge aligned with military precision. As he folded, the others stood behind him, heads slightly bowed, their hands clasped in front of them like at a memorial. This wasn't for show. This was ceremony, sacred in its simplicity. When the final fold was complete, the man pressed the flag to his chest, just above his heart, and took a single step back. Then without command, without a word, all 7 men raised their right hands and saluted. The motion was crisp, perfectly timed. And the diner? Dead silent. Every single person, young or old, veteran or not, understood something extraordinary was happening. Something you didn't interrupt. Something that went beyond words. The cook, Frank, stood just behind the counter. His lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. His eyes glistened. Then a single tear broke free and rolled down his cheek. The waitress had backed away slowly until she was pressed against the wall near the pie display. Her hands trembled. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but then closed again. What could she possibly say? No one took photos. No one pulled out a phone. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was too real, too raw. Everyone understood it instinctively. This was respect. This was brotherhood. This was memory made flesh. The Marines stood in silence for several seconds more, their salutes held, their eyes unflinching. And then, just as calmly as they had entered, they dropped their arms, turned, and walked out, one by one, without a word. The SUV doors opened, closed, the engine started, and they were gone. No names, no explanation. No, thank you for your service. Just silence, and something left behind in their wake. Back inside, the diners remained frozen in place. For several long moments, no one even breathed. Then Frank slowly stepped out from behind the counter, his apron still on, and approached the table. He didn't touch the flag. He just looked at it, then looked at the empty booth where Walter had sat. He cleared his throat quietly. "Bring me a glass of water, will you?" he said to the waitress, voice shaking. She nodded but didn't move. She couldn't. Her eyes were locked on that table, her face pale and stunned. Because in all her time working there, she'd never seen anything like that. And deep down, she knew she never would again. The rain had slowed to a whisper when the black SUV finally pulled away from the diner. Inside, 7 men sat in silence. No one turned on the radio. No one reached for a phone. The only sound was the steady rhythm of windshield wipers brushing away the drizzle. In the front passenger seat sat James "Red" Callahan, a former gunnery sergeant who had once shared a foxhole with Walter Dean over 50 years ago. Red wasn't the kind of man to show emotion, not in the war, not in peace. But as he held the faded envelope in his gloved hand, his jaw clenched a little tighter. It was Walter's handwriting. The letter had arrived 3 days earlier. No return address, just the initials WD in the corner. The paper smelled faintly of cedar, the kind of scent that came from drawers where medals and old photographs were stored. Red had opened it carefully, as if something fragile might fall out. The ink was shaky in places, but the words were unmistakably Walter's. "Red, this flag has been with me longer than any living person. Through wars, through funerals, through nights, I thought I wouldn't make it to morning. It kept me alive somehow. A reminder of what we were, what we stood for, and who I lost. But it doesn't need me anymore. And truthfully, I don't think I need it either. If you ever see it again, don't let it be forgotten. W." There was a second note, scribbled almost as an afterthought at the bottom corner. "P.S. Mason would have been 39 this Thursday." That line hit harder than the rest. Mason, Walter's boy. They'd all known him, watched him grow up in the base housing units, saw the same sharp look in his eye as his father. When the news came that Mason had been killed in Afghanistan, None of them had known what to say. Walter had vanished from their monthly veteran breakfast after that, stopped answering calls, stopped showing up to the Legion Hall, stopped replying to group messages. He became a ghost. Red folded the letter, pressed it to his chest, and made one phone call. That's all it took. No questions asked, just 6 words. He's letting go. Thursday morning. They knew exactly what that meant. Each man had come from a different town. Some had to take time off work. One drove overnight from Oregon. They didn't care. If Walter was finally letting go of the one thing that had held him together, then they would be there to catch whatever was left. But more than that, they knew what today was, Mason's birthday. Walter had never spoken about it, but they all knew. Every year on this day, he disappeared into himself. No calls, no visits, just silence. And if Walter had chosen this day, of all days, to place that flag on a diner table and walk away, it wasn't just a gesture, it was a farewell. They didn't go to the diner to ask questions. They didn't go to offer help. They went to stand with their brother, one final time, without words, just as they always had, in the jungle, in the desert, in the dark. And when they saw that wrinkled flag still resting where he left it, it told them everything they needed to know. Walter didn't want the flag remembered. He wanted the meaning behind it to live on. And that's exactly what they came to do. The sun was low on the horizon, painting the waves with a soft golden hue. The wind rolled off the ocean, gentle but constant, the kind that made you squint into the distance without realizing why. Seagulls drifted silently above. The beach was mostly empty, save for a single figure seated on a weathered bench near the shore. Walter Dean sat alone, shoulders hunched slightly forward, a worn wool cap pulled low over his brow. In his hands rested a small wooden box, its lid open, its inside bare. His fingers ran along the edges slowly, not out of restlessness, but reverence. He had brought the box to say goodbye, not to the flag, not to Mason, but to something deeper, to the duty, to the weight. He hadn't expected anyone to find him here, but he should have known better. The crunch of gravel and sand behind him was unmistakable, steady, familiar. Walter didn't turn. He didn't need to. He recognized the cadence of boots that still moved like Marines, even in retirement. 7 men approached, slowly, without ceremony. Their coats fluttered slightly in the breeze. None spoke. None needed to. They simply formed a quiet semicircle behind the bench and remained standing for a moment, their silence saying more than any greeting could. Red was the first to step forward. From inside his coat, he carefully pulled out the folded American flag, the very one Walter had left behind in the diner. It had been refolded with care, crisp edges, and reverence. Red knelt beside the bench, his face level with Walter's. He didn't say, "We found it." He didn't ask, "Why did you leave it?" He just placed the flag in Walter's open hands and said, with a quiet voice made rough by years of grit, "There's no flag more worthy to keep fighting beside you." Walter looked down at the cloth in his lap. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from something that stirred deep inside. Something heavy that had finally started to lift. For a moment he said nothing, just stared at the flag as if seeing it for the first time. Not as a symbol of death, but of everything that had lived inside him. Sacrifice, loyalty, love, pain, silence. And then he smiled. It was a small smile, almost unsure, like a man remembering how to use a muscle long forgotten. But it reached his eyes, and those eyes glistened, soft and shining, not with grief, but with recognition. "I thought I'd been forgotten," he whispered, voice thin but clear. Red placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Not a chance, brother." The others sat down beside him, on the bench, on the sand, wherever there was room. No ranks, no formations, just men who had come through fire together and still showed up when it mattered. They didn't talk much after that, just watch the waves roll in, watch the sun inch lower, watch the sky fade to orange and blue. There was peace in it, not closure. Walter didn't believe in that, but connection. The kind that war had forged, time had tested, and loyalty had preserved. And as the last light dipped beneath the water, Walter held the flag close against his chest. This time, not as a burden, but as a brother. How many people like Walter have we passed by without a second glance? How many men and women, quiet and forgotten, carry histories heavier than we'll ever know? Memories folded away in silence, just like that flag. It's easy in the rush of daily life to miss them. An old man with a limp at the grocery store, a quiet woman sitting alone at the bus stop, a stranger at a diner with faded eyes and a strong black coffee habit. But behind some of those faces are chapters of sacrifice, of loss, of service that shape the very freedoms we often take for granted. Walter Dean didn't ask to be remembered. He didn't ask for applause or headlines or medals. He simply carried a flag, not for show but for meaning, for his son, for his brothers, for the country he quietly gave everything for. And when he finally laid it down, he wasn't letting go of pride, he was letting go of pain, hoping maybe that someone would remember not just the cloth, but the cost, that someone would see the battle behind the wrinkles. And when those 7 Marines walked in and saluted without a word, that was all the recognition he needed. No music, no speeches, just silent honor, the kind that doesn't demand attention, but earns it. So here's the question for all of us. Do we still recognize the ones who once carried us on their backs? The veterans who don't wear their service on their sleeves, but who feel it in every scar and every empty chair at the dinner table? If you've known someone like Walter, if a moment from this story reminded you of your father, your neighbor, your uncle, or your friend, I hope you'll share their name in the comments. Tell us who they were. Let the world hear about them, even if they never asked to be heard. Because those flags we see folded in boxes or resting on mantles, they're not decorations. They're not just old cloth. They're chapters. They're echoes. They're the quiet, wrinkled reminders of people who never stopped serving, even when no one was watching. And maybe, just maybe, by remembering them, we become a little more worthy of what they gave us. If this story moved you, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the channel. Not for me, but for the countless Walters out there who still sit quietly by the window, wondering if anyone remembers. Don't let their stories fade, and don't ever let those flags become just fabric. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next one.